Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Thrive Co-Living podcast and YouTube broadcast. Thrive Co-Living is a new concept in creative community building. Sustainable, multicultural, multi-generational, and inclusive, Thrive Co-Living communities are built from repurposed big box stores or other suitable buildings. In this series, myself, Jennifer Hooper, and Thrive founder, Mark Stein, will weave together the tapestry that makes up the physical and spiritual components of this new concept in community living. Now on with the show. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Thrive Co-Living podcast. My name is Jennifer Hooper. I am co-host of this podcast along with Mark Stein, who is the founder of Thrive Co-Living Communities, an inclusive residential community developed in repurposed big box stores for people of all ages. And we are joined today by Adam Rubin, who is the founder and partner of 2 Revolutions, that's the number 2 Revolutions, which helps communities transform their future of learning. And I'm really excited to dive in to this interview because I certainly don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all model for all people, and I believe Adam believes the same thing. So let's dive in. And Adam, I'll start off by asking you to tell us about your work and your philosophy towards education.
Absolutely. It would be a pleasure. And thank you for inviting me. Excited with the project you guys are undertaking. So 2 Revolutions is a dozen years old. We are an education design lab. And for the past 11 and a half years, my wife would be unable to answer at a cocktail party, "What does your husband do?" She's a very intelligent woman, but what the hell is an education design lab? So we really work as an organization focused from really birth to 26, but most of our work is K-12 and higher ed, where we help folks define their future of learning. We help organizations and communities, and every organization is in a community. So when we have our druthers, that's really a community-driven process to define the future of learning, and then we help them build it and implement it. So what it looks like concretely is we have a schools practice to really transform learning models. So we transform learning models in K-12 and in higher ed. We've probably helped give birth to a couple hundred schools around the US, both K-12 and higher ed over the past years. We do a lot around systems. So we are deep believers that systems enable or inhibit, and the conditions within systems either enable or inhibit innovation. So we work a lot with systems leaders. In some places that is the mayor and his or her team, and other places that's a school superintendent, and other places it's a really innovative leader of a school or dean of a school. And we help them kind of identify a set of conditions that either help or hinder their work. And then all of our work is really about transforming capacity building, which gets to your good question about philosophy. What I hear, I forget. What I see, I remember. What I do, I know. I've kind of honed in on that quote. I attribute it to Confucius, but we all attribute it to somebody. But this idea of applied learning is so central. So lots of our work, and happy to expand on it, really deals with this idea of how do you engender ownership of the learning process, whether I'm working with a 4-year-old or I'm working with a 50-year-old, and so much of our work is with adult learners. How do we actually engender ownership so it's not happening to them? And then how are we building much more equitable systems? And I will go into depth on equity because I feel like it's very bandied about, especially now, but we need to have a clear understanding and definition of what we mean when we say equity.
I love it. I really love it.
Adam, who typically brings you into a system, and what are their motivations? Are they in deep trouble? Is there somebody that is a visionary and they're wanting to get support? It may be all over the spectrum, but talk a little bit about when you're called in and what the motives are?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are brought in by a couple of different mechanisms. Usually in our K-12 work, it's an innovative superintendent or chief academic officer who is dissatisfied with the status quo and wants to really innovate, or they're in progress of innovating and they need to build deeper muscles, build deeper leadership capacity. So we get tapped most often from district leadership. We work with a lot of the large national education foundations, from Gates to Carnegie to Chan Zuckerberg to Dell to the Bush Foundation. And we work with a spectrum of large national and then local regional foundations, and they are often the ones fomenting and supporting financially the change. And then we do a good amount of work with state agencies, state education agencies, and then finally schools of education. They are such a critical part of the ecosystem. I believe deeply that they are part of the problem, but in many places they can be and are part of the solution, because they train the majority of the pipeline of new teachers, and they also do so much professional development for sitting teachers. So we try to work with schools of ed as much as possible.
Adam, what would you say is currently some of the most exciting endeavors happening in this field or in your organization these days? What are you seeing that really lights you up?
Well, it's also, all of the questions are good questions, I'm sure. I think education right now is a very flawed model. The American education system is the largest cottage industry in the world, a multi-trillion-dollar a year industry, just K-12, implicating 55 million kids, about 4 million educators. So just think about that, almost 60 million Americans, not to mention families. So, 60 million Americans are directly touching public schools and private schools every day. Just think about that for a second. It's massive.
Huge.
I'd say by and large, traditional. So I began my career as an educator. I have been an educator, I've been an administrator, I've been an entrepreneur, almost exclusively in the education space, some on the community development side, but majority of my career has been as an educator. And then 16 years ago, I became a consumer. So I've been an educator and an advocate and a transformist. And then I became a consumer, and I have 4 daughters, all of whom will be in the public school system in a couple of weeks. Our youngest is 5, our oldest is 16. So we're just getting the youngest in. And so I've seen public education. We've done work in about 38 states, pretty deep work in lots of those states. So we have one of the best vantage points, I'd say, in the country. We've peeked over hedges at SEAs, LEAs, so state agencies, districts, private schools, public schools, higher ed, and really seen a lot of systems that aren't working. And here's why I think they're not working. Reason number one, because they don't put the kid or the learner first. It's really a system that is built around the adults. The biggest COVID-related challenge was childcare. Among the biggest, related to education. Like, education is a core childcare function. We all know that as parents, but we don't internalize that until it disappears. I think the second thing is this idea of agency, this idea of ownership. School happens to kids. When we talk about education, we use the word education, we use the word school, we don't use the word learning often enough. And to really bring it back to this idea, separating education from learning, learning is an active thing. Learning is a verb, I learn. That is something I can get excited about. Education is a noun, and school is a noun. Like, let's make a verb out of learning, and let's put the keys to the kingdom in the hands of the kids. And then, in all of our professional learning work, we run MED programs. We're building an EDD right now for educators. We run a lot of certificate, graduate cert programs. Like, too many educators in the system are, it's happening to them. It's disenfranchising them. It's disempowering them. So I think those are all the things that are broken, but that wasn't your question. But I wanted to lay out the landscape. I think there are amazing things going on. And I think COVID can be a really exciting accelerant. I think this idea of putting the learner in the center and making the pedagogy and the culture and the structures of school focused first and foremost on the learning and on the learner. I think secondly, COVID is really shining a light on this idea of traditional versus mastery based. When kids start up in some systems, they're going to start up in a couple of weeks, and others it'll be 6 weeks out, 8 weeks out. But when kids come back to school, we're going to have the largest learning gap that we've ever had. Traditionally, and that's one of the biggest equity issues we have, poor kids often begin school by virtue of a summer slide of 10, 11 weeks, meaningfully behind. This year, we've got 6 months of summer slide, and it's going to be gargantuan. So we are deep believers in, first of all, places need to define their own future of learning, but once they do, we have opinions. And I believe competency-based education and mastery-based education is a much more respectful and productive way to promote student learning. It's this idea that what you know and can do, you can demonstrate with evidence, and then you move on when you're ready. It's not the age stamped on your head. We have a system that is really structurally broken because kids are moving with their age, not with their intellectual peer cohort. So I really feel like competency-based education is among the most exciting things we're involved in.
I think that's awesome. I homeschooled my kids for a number of years because I really believed that they would learn what they wanted to learn based on their interests. And, I spent some time in this homeschool community with other parents, and they would have children who didn't read. And then all of a sudden, age 12, they're reading Harry Potter right out of the gate, So I agree with you that age-based learning, to me, does not make sense.
Yeah, well, and and Jennifer, you touch on interest. Like, where my passion lies, I'm going to excel.
Absolutely.
So hit me at the place of my passion, tap into my passion. So I think too many schools aren't teaching kids to think and aren't serving up an opportunity to apply their passion. And I think the ones that do see more engaged learners, they see more motivated learners, and they see better outcomes for those learners because of it. I don't think it's rocket science. I think we all know it. We do this exercise when we're in a room of, 50 or 200 adults. We show them this quick video of a little girl learning how to dubstep, and we show a number of different videos, but it's a 2-minute video, and she's teaching herself. And then we process with them, and we say, okay, tell us something you've learned in the last 6 months. How did you learn it, and could you teach us? And it's it's between a 15-minute and it can be an hour-long exercise. But what's really rich is we center the conversation on what they've learned and how they've learned it. And lo and behold, the biggest correlates in that room are they learned something based on interest or passion. And then for a third of the room, it's usually compliance orientation. They had to learn it for work. But when people are being honest and they're not with their peers, it's an interest-based learning or a passion-based learning. And I think that's a microcosm of what school and what learning should look like for all kids.
Yeah. I'm right there with you. I love it. I'm on board.
So, Adam, talk about some of the people, past and present, that have influenced you the most in education. We've talked about some of the things that are going on that you're passionate about, but who influenced you in your thinking and philosophy? Some of them.
Yeah, I would say, and this is cliche, but I feel like I learned the most about education from my learners. So many, many years ago when I was teaching, there was a kid named James Mitchell, and James Mitchell was a functionally illiterate 8th grader in Oakland, California, and I had the honor of being his teacher. And James taught me to tap into his interest, and we did this multi-age tutoring program with first graders, and James just showed up. He literally started showing up, but figuratively he started showing up. And the ability for him not to be a victim, but to be an expert, even though he was no reading expert, he was reading above a first grade level, and therefore he was an expert. And that turned James around. So, I think that the kind of personal anecdotes are really important. I think Kurt Hahn was the founder of Outward Bound in Wales, post-World War II. And I think this idea of applied learning has had a huge influence on me. I started my teaching career teaching service learning and teaching applied learning and project-based learning in Oakland, California. And this idea of being able to not regurgitate theory, but apply learning and show evidence is just so potent and powerful. And we use it completely in our practice today. We're not taking educators on Outward Bound courses, but intellectually we are. We will not accept a paper in any of our graduate programs that we run. You need to show me a portfolio of evidence, and then you need to be able to explicate it. So Kurt Hahn, this idea of applied learning is really powerful. Steve Biko, I don't know if that's a familiar name, but Steve Biko was a Black Power leader in apartheid South Africa.
Okay.
Steve Biko was among the most powerful educators who really began to educate the townships that speaking Afrikaans was not okay. And he was the linchpin behind what became the Soweto massacre, where a ton of school children were massacred. He was killed in detention. There's an amazing movie that changed my life. I actually lived in South Africa for a couple of years and set up an NGO there called Cry Freedom. Denzel plays Steve Biko, but just a powerful story. But as an educator, he shifted an entire narrative of 100 years that told, South African Blacks that they weren't good enough. And then finally, there's this guy, I call him the godfather of adult learning theory. His name is Malcolm Knowles, and I've learned a lot from Malcolm Knowles. Malcolm Knowles came up and further developed a theory of andragogy. So pedagogy is the teaching of children. Andragogy is Greek for the teaching of men or the teaching of adults. And he basically laid out a thesis, and what has been powerful for me is the comparison between pedagogy and andragogy. How adults learn is different than how children learn. We need to honor the lived experience. We need to empower and treat every adult not as incomplete, but as complete and having an opportunity to further develop. The experts are always in any room that we're in because, far be it for us to be the experts. We bring some expertise, but so do you, and so do you, and so do I. So Knowles really has, developed this theory of how do you tap into the 20-year, 30-year veteran? And then how do you help them understand that their learning experience is really different? It needs to be applied. It needs to be relevant to them. It needs to be job embedded. So Knowles has really influenced my worldviews.
Great, thank you. And there are some new names for me, so we'll put them in the show notes, and lots of people can look them up. Let me ask you about one in particular, and he's very popular, or has been the last 10 years, and that's Sal Khan with Khan Academy.
Yeah.
What are some of your thoughts about his approach and his book?
I think I've got a lot of respect for Sal and what he's been able to do. I think this idea of flipping content, this idea of acknowledging different learning styles, creating the opportunity to learn and relearn, and making content available for all learners anytime, anywhere, I mean, we have a digital divide that is shrinking, but we still have it in lots of places, including Jennifer, I'm sure 20 miles from you. Certainly 20 miles from me, Vermont struggles with broadband.
Well, even just it's just not available to everybody.
Well, it's not available to everybody, but
Yeah.
for those for whom it is available, and I think in this kind of COVID remote learning environment, which is not going away, we coach districts all over the country right now on how to re-enter, and everybody's scurrying to develop their plans, and they've got 3 plans, and there will be a spike, most likely. Nobody has a crystal ball, right? They're all broken on the floor. So I feel as if Khan's work provides an opportunity to democratize content, and I think was really path breaking. And in this COVID moment, I think provides a lot of really quality resources. With that, I'll say, not all learners learn one way. I don't think anybody has the market cornered. Any name you throw at me who's a theorist or a doer in this space has done good work, but to the point at the beginning of the call, it's never one size fits all. I mean, I think that's our baseline philosophy. That's why the agency to set your future of learning will be different than Mark's, will be different than Bangor's, will be different than Burlington's, etc. So I think Khan's work is great and important.
He also focused a lot on mastery and the problems of not mastering, especially as it relates to math.
Yeah.
Being able to pass with 70%, meaning that they don't know 30% of the content, and moving up into math. I think it explained a lot for me.
Yeah, this concept is so important, Mark. I'm glad you went there. This idea of mastery, and I think it bridges to kind of, non-traditional learning, adult learning, the co-generational learning that you all will foment and support. Like Ford and GM both had factories. GM and Toyota. GM had a policy that all of the folks to get on the line had to take a 3-week course, and they had to pass with a 60. Toyota's policy was you needed 80%. It wasn't time limited. It was competency based. You could take it as many times as possible. And, there's a lot more nuance to the story, but at the end of the day, do you want somebody who got a 61 assembling your car? You want somebody who got an 81 or higher? And I mean, like, at the end of the day, let's not make learning time-based. Let's make it mastery-based so folks actually learn it.
That makes so much sense to me.
Such good logic, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
One would think our public education system would be structured on that.
You would think.
Yeah.
You mentioned some differences between young learners and adult learners. Do you have anything else to add to that in terms of the differences and how to approach education in these different audiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think, increasingly my view is moving to andragogy for all learners. And because I think what we want for kids is not sit and get and, pour knowledge into their heads and we are the experts. Like, as quickly as we can empower all learners to own their experience, I think that's essential. I think what you all are trying to do, as I understand it, is really, really powerful. And I think, earlier in my career, I had a lot of opportunities to, catalyze multi-generational learning. And it was so powerful. We took high school students in Oakland and in the Bronx and in Cape Town and began to work with seniors. And the mutual benefits, and those are kind of extreme examples, right? At both ends of the spectrum, I think there's power across the spectrum. But I think one of the things and one of the reasons, Mark, I'm so intrigued by the concept and would love to be supportive in any way we can, is we've lost, as you well know, and you've talked about it and written about it, and you're actualizing it in the experiment, we've lost generational connections. And I think we lose so much when we lose that. So, I mean, that's a meta point, but as it relates to learning, we learn so much more from each other. And it's a two-way street. My 5-year-old teaches me as much as she learns from me. So, I think to have a community that is really setting up intentional learning, and some of it might be in a classroom to learn a concept, but lots of it might be, at the events and at, just opportunities, creating opportunities to learn together. Again, let's de-silo learning from a box and 9 to 3 or the afternoon or evening class. Like, I think you have an opportunity to do both really effectively, which is exciting.
Yeah, just to emphasize your point, I've seen firsthand how multi-age really supports each other. I mean, supports the education process. After my kids were homeschooled, they went to a non-traditional school with a group of children from kindergartners to, I think, 13 middle schoolers.
Mm.
And the 5-year-olds would sit on the older kids' laps, and the older kid would read to the younger kid. And there was just so much dialogue among them that, the younger ones just soaked up. They just wanted to learn all the things that the older kids were learning, and vice versa. The older kids could see how the younger kids were responding and really respond themselves to that. And then what was the other example I was going to say?
Well, I've got
It
one
kind
while
of
you're
goes in
thinking.
one ear and in my head, in my brain, and out the other. But go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I've got another example while you think of it. And so my grandson, when he was about 7, he and I went out to rollerblade for the first time together. And I was rusty, and I posed as even rustier than I was. And he got such a thrill out of coaching me and teaching me shift your weight and to see and we see that all the time with kids, the pride that they take in teaching. Of course, right at the end of my lesson, he's standing there, I'm about to get up, and both feet come out from under him at the same time. So his pride was a little wounded at that moment. But seeing that pride at teaching and being able to teach an older person something that they don't know is so empowering for the kids.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
that's it. I think it's this idea of empowerment. Ultimately,
Yes. Yeah.
learning should be about personal empowerment and social empowerment, and it can be an intergenerational, kind of cross-generational learning experience by virtue of having proximity, by virtue of having programming, is so potent. And there's a huge research base on the benefits to both, to all participants at every level, because you're at one part teacher and you're one part learner.
Yeah, I remembered my other example, and that is
Good.
my oldest daughter is now taking the lead and teaching me some things. And we share a lot of documentaries back and forth, but in certain areas, we're both adults now, but I'm not the one who's leading the way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
She's now leading the way, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm behind her, and it's a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
I really like that. Mark, maybe this would be a really good time to talk about how Thrive is going to be integrating education into the co-living communities.
Well, we're really a blank slate at this point, and want to bring those folks together and have a place for the very young and the very old to come and explore together. And so, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to have Adam on, is to talk to us about some of the potential possibilities that he sees. And I've envisioned having a space where people can come, maybe a tote board of sorts that's listing what each person is interested in sharing or learning. And perhaps having that be virtual as well, so that even if you're not in the space, you're sharing, I'm interested in this. I'd be interested in collaborating with somebody else on this, or I'm interested in sharing about this, to bring people together around certain topics. Have mix co-working with co-learning, and have those spaces be together. I think we're seeing some definitely some problems with co-working, and that this might help solve some of those problems. But anyway, so in an environment like ours, what are some of the things that we could be bringing, Adam?
I mean, I'm excited by the blank slate because I think there's so much potential. And I think this idea of prototyping a number of different approaches. So, one idea is, the passion board where folks get to share their passions. I mean, that's just a way to build community. I'm going to host paella night. Anyone interested? Because I have a passion for making paella. And you start the ball rolling, and what becomes social is also a learning opportunity. I think this idea of none of us are done, right? I mean, lifelong learning is not a cliche. It should be a real thing. So, I'm deeply interested in my work and in my worldview on what motivates people intrinsically and what motivates them extrinsically, because I think we can't ignore the extrinsic. I think we're being naive if we focus on the intrinsic motivation. Like, how nice that you think everyone would look at the tote board or the passion board and engage, but they might not. But if you offered them something they needed, there is something in K-12 that's getting some pickup called extended learning opportunities, ELOs, where you get credit for learning outside of school. I know a lot of kind of middle school and high school students in your future communities who'd be really interested in having an opportunity for that. I think, undergraduate credit and graduate credit are not so inaccessible. Would I be in your shoes? I would look to form partnerships with community colleges and local universities to kind of think about credit-bearing opportunities on site. So I think the sky's the limit. My point is, folks are learning, they're getting training, and then, there's constant need for retraining and new learning opportunities. And if we could kind of link the intrinsic and the extrinsic, I think that would really benefit residents and potentially proximate community members, because, your goal is not to create a gated community by a long shot. It's to create something that adds value to the residents and adds value to the broader community. And what better way than being a site of learning? And I think that's a real opportunity.
We're going to have all sorts of things going on, from hydroponics and aquaponics to solar and environmental things going on. So I think it will provide a lot of learning opportunities that way.
So excited. So excited for Thrive Co-Living. Also excited about these new educational opportunities. I do have another question about our current education system in this country, and can it be reformed, or do you think it should be scrapped and restarted, and will that ever be possible?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the realpolitik of your question is it is such an entrenched structure that scrapping it does not feel viable nor advisable, because in its place could be something less equitable than we currently have, and we're not an equitable system. So I don't believe, I think a few years ago we rejected the word reform in our language, and I think it's shifting reform to transform and providing people with pathways to do that. What does transform look like? And I don't think it doesn't need to be complex. I think having a community-based vision for what success looks like for learners, these are called portraits of a graduate or graduate profiles. Like, every system in the country should have one of those that should be driven by community stakeholders. I mean, teachers, kids, principals, families, business owners, it's happening across the country. Unfortunately, where it stops is it becomes a pretty poster, or it's the front page of your strategic plan, and it doesn't go further. So what we really need to do is we need to support educators with a portrait of an educator that are the knowledge, skills, and mindsets necessary to get to that portrait of a graduate. And then professional learning and supports and structures need to be reimagined to get to that portrait of a graduate. So if I were to pull up, and there's some great websites where you all could peruse portraits of a graduate around the country. Our friends at EdLeader 21, I think, have 50 on their website. They support districts to develop these, so do a lot of us, but that's a core part of what they do. You'll see all of the, and when we're in rooms all over the country running these sessions, nobody ever says ELA or math. What they want their graduates when they walk across the stage in 12th grade to have, and you know the answer, and we look at the 2030, kind of World Economic Forum forecast for jobs in 2030, jobs in 2040. Like, we know we need kids to be able to think. We need them to be able to communicate effectively, collaborate effectively, problem solve. We need them to be literate and numerate, absolutely. But if that's where we stop, which is where public education has stopped measuring, that's a problem. So I think transformation is absolutely possible. There's a good experiment. There's a number of experiments. One we're a little bit more familiar with is called Reschool Colorado. Our friends at the Don L. K. Foundation in Denver have set up an initiative called Reschool Colorado, which essentially is trying to support a model that moves alongside existing K-12, but imagines what education could look like alongside but separate from K-12. And it's really about empowering families. It's about, providing lots of learning opportunities and having advocates supporting families to make good choices. Ultimately, my vision for public education is school is one node on a kid's learning trajectory. There's the museum, there's the park, there's, co-living lessons with grandma, there's, whatever, any number of things that kids are progressing toward their goals. So they're getting credit, they're getting, they have to provide performance tasks. So they have to be able to prove they've learned something, but where they learn it is less important than that they learned it and that they can demonstrate it. And then I think you kind of have a skill print that grows up that is much more than a transcript or report card, that really begins to show evidence and ultimately is transferable outside the walls of K-12 into higher ed, into the workplace. And this skill print is what travels with you. And I think that is a very future-oriented vision for what lifelong learning, because the minute we dismantle we separate the transcript, and it's not a technical solution, like the transcript is the problem, but we need to create portability in learning, and we haven't figured that out. So I think those are some factors that are critical to kind of transform public education in this country.
Wow, thank you.
COVID has really turned the education world from kindergarten through master's programs and doctoral programs on its head, and it's really exposed, interesting word, but exposed a lot of the vulnerabilities in the system. What are your hopes? It's transforming, like it, love it, whatever. It's transforming education as we speak, just physically. What are some of your hopes that could come out of this because of the structural problems that have been created with COVID? And we probably could do an entire episode on it, but let's summarize it.
Yeah, we won't be the first and we won't be the last. We've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Anybody who spends, 2.5 decades of their work in this space thinks about a big moment. So I wrote a piece, and I'll share it with you guys for the show notes if it's of interest and helpful. And I wrote that piece in mid-March about how COVID was cracking open public education, which was a good thing, and what might come from it. I focused more on the bigness of this moment and having the courage to step through. I think what COVID has exposed is a couple of core things. I think instruction is by and large too traditional, too sit and get, and it's not learner driven, right? I think COVID has flipped that dramatically, and whether we want to or not, the kids are now much more in charge, which is good. The bad part is nobody was ready for it, and most systems did this pretty poorly, and that's not a knock. It's like this isn't how they were trained. But I think that's a technical solution. We can absolutely, we are, and a lot of great folks around the country are really helping folks understand high quality remote learning that motivates and that, provides deeper, more rigorous learning. So that's solvable. I think the post-COVID reality is something more learner driven. I think the post-COVID reality is something that is more mastery based. So to the earlier part of the conversation, to the Sal Khan reference, show me and tell me with evidence that you know how to do something, and let's kind of think about grade bands, not grade levels. So increasingly in the fall, more progressive and more responsive, and those are two different things, school districts are going to allow kids to float, at least in core subjects like English and math, based on ability rather than grade level. And I think increasingly pre-COVID, the most progressive systems in the country were beginning to do it with grade levels and doing kind of bands of kids, 1, 3, 4, 6, and allowing kids to flex much more because that's how they naturally come in. Like they come in with a higher, literacy and, lower math, and let's meet them where they are. I think the third thing, Mark and Jennifer, is this idea of equity. I think exposed is a really good word. Like most Americans didn't know that half of the public school kids in this country get their meals from public education. They didn't know that families didn't have devices. They didn't think about a quiet space to learn. They didn't think about high stakes state assessments and how inequitable those are. I'm not advocating getting rid of them, but I think they give an incomplete view of a learner because they take place at a moment in time, and that's the score. In a different kind of system, we will test kids much more often. We'll use multiple measures, and getting the 80% versus getting a 59 and being able to move on because we have to move on. I think COVID is exposing all of those inequities. So my hope is that we have a more learner-driven, a more mastery-based, and a more equitable system. And, I said this early on, and I'll come back to it. Equity is about the structures that, uphold power structures and, keep inequity in place. And that's assessment policies, that's grading policies, that's culture in buildings. We have a very well-intentioned, but it's kind of a noblesse oblige teaching force, not across the board, but in lots of systems that have a set of middle-class, often white values, and we foist those on kids, and if they don't fit our definition of success, there's judgment. And that does those kids a disservice. So when we say culturally responsive, it means culturally responsive and not, defaulting to the majority norm, if there is a majority anymore, which I think our country is moving away from. And then finally, equity is about teacher practices. How do we really support teachers to teach in a much more equitable, anti-racist, anti-biased fashion? So I think a post-COVID world has the potential to do lots of those things better.
Awesome. Really awesome. We'll definitely put a link to that article in the show notes. You go ahead and send it to me, and I will make sure it goes there.
Great.
Mark, do you have any more questions for Adam?
No, I just really have appreciated the conversation, and I hope we can stay connected and communicating as we build towards our first facility. And I think we're the three of us are of like mind and can really benefit from your experience and your thoughts, and so I hope we can we can stay engaged.
Well, I want to thank both of you for the time. It's always fun, if not a little narcissistic, to be interviewed, but I thank you. It's meaningful to talk about something that I think is really important to the state of our country, the state of our world, and the state of communities like the one you're building. And, Mark, absolutely. It would be such a pleasure to help kind of seed high quality, thoughtful, rigorous, lifelong learning. So if we could be at all helpful, we would love to.
Awesome.
Adam, how can people connect with you if they want to learn more about Two Revolutions?
They can visit our website. That's a good first place. And it's www.2revolutions.net. And I will send you a couple of articles. We wrote a chapter of a book on kind of adult learning theory a couple of years ago that, for a certain small number of listeners might be of interest. We would welcome
Fantastic.
it. But, we'll send some stuff.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. I know you're busy, and we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you both. Good luck.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Thrive Co-Living podcast and YouTube broadcast. To discover more about our mission, activities, and how to find us on social media, please check out our website at thrivecolivingcommunities.org. There you can also learn how you can support this creative vision in community co-living. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back soon.